The kingdom of Eldoria had stood for centuries, its towering stone walls and sprawling castles a testament to the power of its rulers, but now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, an eerie stillness settled over the land. The people had grown weary under the rule of King Aldric, a man whose once just heart had hardened with age, his decisions becoming increasingly unpredictable, his temper as sharp as the swords of his royal guard. In the quiet village of Blackthorn, nestled deep within the kingdom's forests, a young woman named Elara sat by the hearth of her modest home, her fingers tracing the worn pages of an ancient book her grandmother had left her, its contents filled with forgotten legends and whispered prophecies. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and distant smoke, a reminder that unrest was brewing beyond the safety of the village borders. Elara had always felt a strange pull toward the unknown, a curiosity that set her apart from the other villagers, who were content with their simple lives of farming and trade. But tonight, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced upon the walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would drag her far from the only home she had ever known. Unbeknownst to her, in the capital city of Valenhold, King Aldric had just signed a decree that would send his armies sweeping through the countryside in search of a long-lost artifact, a relic said to hold the power to reshape the world, and his scouts were already closing in on Blackthorn, their orders clear: leave no stone unturned, no home unsearched, no villager unquestioned. Chapter 2. The first sign of trouble came at dawn, when the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley, stirring the villagers from their sleep. Elara, who had spent a restless night haunted by strange dreams of crumbling castles and whispering shadows, was among the first to peer out her window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the figures clad in the king's colors approach, their banners fluttering in the cold morning air. Her heart pounded as she realized they were heading straight for Blackthorn, their armor gleaming dully under the pale light of the rising sun. Within minutes, the village square was filled with soldiers, their commander, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, barking orders as his men began dragging people from their homes, demanding answers to questions no one understood. Elara's fingers tightened around the edge of her curtain as she watched Old Man Harlow, the village baker, shoved to his knees, his face pressed into the dirt as a soldier loomed over him, demanding to know if he had any knowledge of the Eclipse Stone. The name sent a shiver down Elara's spine. It was mentioned in her grandmother's book, a relic of immense power, said to be hidden by the last of the ancient druids. Before she could process the implications, a heavy fist pounded on her door, the wood shuddering under the force, and she knew she had only seconds to decide: hide the book and risk being caught with it, or flee and abandon everything she had ever known. Chapter 3. The door burst open before Elara could move, splintering under the boot of a soldier whose cold eyes scanned the room with methodical precision. She barely had time to shove the book beneath the loose floorboard before he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, dragging her into the chaos outside where the villagers were being lined up like criminals. The commander, his voice dripping with disdain, announced that Blackthorn was suspected of harboring traitors to the crown, and until the Eclipse Stone was found, no one would be allowed to leave. Elara's mind raced as she was shoved into line beside the other villagers, her pulse thundering in her ears. She knew the book contained clues to the relic's location, but revealing that knowledge would mark her as a target, not just for the king's men, but for whatever forces sought the stone for their own ends. As the interrogation dragged on, the soldiers growing increasingly frustrated with the villagers' ignorance, Elara caught the eye of a hooded figure lurking at the edge of the square, their face obscured but their posture tense, as if waiting for the right moment to act. Before she could ponder their identity, a shout erupted from the crowd. One of the soldiers had found a hidden cellar beneath the tavern, its walls carved with strange symbols matching those described in her grandmother's book. The commander's smile was venomous as he declared the village complicit in treason, his hand rising to signal his men to arrest everyone. But in that moment, the hooded figure moved, a flash of steel cutting through the air as the first soldier fell, and chaos erupted. Chapter 4. The square dissolved into pandemonium as the hooded stranger fought with lethal precision, their blade ablur as they cut down soldiers with terrifying efficiency. Elara, frozen for only a heartbeat, seized the opportunity to break free, ducking beneath the arm of a distracted guard and sprinting toward her home, her only thought to retrieve the book before it was too late. Behind her, the clash of steel and screams filled the air, but she didn't dare look back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she skidded inside and pried up the floorboard, clutching the ancient text to her chest. She had no idea who the hooded figure was or why they had intervened, but she knew staying in Blackthorn meant death or worse. Grabbing a satchel, she stuffed the book inside along with a few meager supplies, her hands shaking as she tied it shut. Just as she turned to flee out the back, the door crashed open again, and this time, it was the hooded figure standing there, their face still hidden but their voice low and urgent as they ordered her to follow if she wanted to live. Elara hesitated for only a second before nodding, and then they were running, darting between houses and into the dense forest beyond, the sounds of pursuit fading but never quite disappearing. The stranger moved with unnatural grace, as if they knew every root and stone in their path, and though 1,000 questions burned in Elara's mind, she forced herself to focus on keeping up, her legs aching as they climbed higher into the hills. It wasn't until they reached a hidden cave, its entrance obscured by thick vines, that the figure finally stopped, pulling back their hood to reveal the face of a woman with piercing green eyes and a jagged scar across her brow. "You're the one they're after," she said, her voice steady. "And if you want to survive, you'll need to learn what that book really means." Chapter 5. Elara's throat tightened as the woman's words sank in, her fingers instinctively clutching the satchel tighter. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the last hour pressing down on her like a physical force. The woman didn't answer immediately, instead lighting a small lantern that cast flickering shadows across the cave walls, revealing stacks of supplies, weapons, maps, and jars of unidentifiable substances. "My name is Kaela," she said finally, turning to face Elara with an intensity that made her take a step back. "I was once a member of the King's Guard, until I learned what he's truly after. The Eclipse Stone isn't just a relic, it's a weapon, one that could tear the world apart if he finds it." Elara's mind reeled as Kaela explained that the king had been searching for the stone for years, convinced it would grant him invincibility, but the book in Elara's possession held the key to its location, written in a code only those of druid blood could decipher. "Your grandmother was the last of their line," Kaela continued, her eyes boring into Elara's. "And that makes you the only one who can stop this." Elara shook her head, the words too absurd to process. She was no one, a village girl with no training, no power. But Kaela's expression didn't waver. "The king's men won't stop until they have you," she said. "And if you don't learn to fight back, you'll die. So decide now, run and hide, or stand and fight." Outside the cave, the wind howled like a warning, and in that moment, Elara knew there was no going back. She took a deep breath, her hands steadying as she met Kaela's gaze. "Teach me." Chapter 6. The days blurred together as Kaela trained Elara in the hidden depths of the cave, their makeshift home becoming a fortress of knowledge and steel. Every morning began with grueling exercises, pushing Elara's body to its limits as she learned to wield a dagger, to dodge attacks, to move silently like a shadow. Kaela was a relentless teacher, her patience thin but her skill undeniable, and though Elara's muscles screamed in protest, she refused to complain, knowing each bruise and cut was a lesson that might save her life. In the evenings, they pored over the ancient book, its pages filled with cryptic verses and faded illustrations of the Eclipse Stone, a jagged, obsidian-like shard said to pulse with the power of the vanished druids. Kaela explained that the stone had been split into 3 fragments centuries ago, hidden across Eldoria to prevent its misuse, and the king had already located one, his dark mages using its energy to twist the land into something foul. "The second fragment is here," Elara murmured one night, tracing a passage that spoke of a forest that breathes, a place where the trees themselves would guide the worthy. Kaela's eyes darkened. The Whispering Woods, she said. A cursed place, where men go mad and the air is thick with old magic. Elara shuddered, but there was no alternative. If the king found the second fragment before they did, his power would grow unstoppable. As they prepared to leave the cave at dawn, Elara caught her reflection in a pool of water and barely recognized herself. Her hands were calloused, her eyes sharp with a determination she'd never known. She was no longer just a villager. She was a hunter, and the king's men would soon learn to fear her. Chapter 7. The Whispering Woods lived up to their name. From the moment Elara and Kaela stepped beneath the gnarled, towering trees, the air hummed with a low, whispering chant, voices without bodies murmuring in a language just beyond comprehension. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of damp moss and something metallic, like old blood. Kaela moved with cautious precision, her sword drawn, her eyes scanning the shifting shadows. "The woods test intruders," she muttered. "They'll show you your fears. Don't listen." Elara nodded, but soon the whispers grew louder, forming words, her grandmother's voice, calling her name, then the screams of Blackthorn's villagers as the king's men burned it to the ground. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus on the path ahead, but the illusions grew sharper, figures darting between the trees, skeletal hands clawing at her ankles. Then, without warning, the ground gave way beneath her, and she tumbled into a sunken pit, the fall knocking the breath from her lungs. Above, Kaela shouted her name, but the edges of the pit were too steep to climb. As Elara struggled to her knees, she realized the walls were carved with the same symbols from the book, glowing faintly in the dim light. A test. The whispers crescendoed, now a chorus of accusing voices, but one phrase cut through the noise: "Prove your worth." Gritting her teeth, Elara pressed her palm against the largest symbol, and the ground beneath her shuddered, the pit's floor sliding open to reveal a hidden staircase descending into darkness. Kaela's rope dropped down moments later, but Elara knew what she had to do. "I'll find the fragment," she called up. "Wait here." And before Kaela could protest, she stepped into the abyss. Chapter 8. The staircase led to a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in shadow, the only light coming from bioluminescent fungi clinging to the walls like stars. Elara's footsteps echoed as she moved forward, the book's pages fluttering in her mind. This was a sacred place, a temple of the old world. At the cavern's center stood a pedestal, and atop it, encased in a sphere of swirling mist, was the second fragment of the Eclipse Stone. Its surface was unlike anything Elara had seen, black as void, yet shimmering with colors that had no name, pulsing as if alive. She reached for it, but a voice stopped her cold. "You are not the first to come here." From the darkness emerged a figure draped in tattered robes, his face hidden beneath a deep hood, his skeletal fingers clutching a staff carved from bone. The keeper of the fragment. Elara's hand flew to her dagger, but the figure made no move to attack. "Many have sought this power," he rasped. "All have failed the trial." Before Elara could speak, the cavern dissolved around her, and she was standing in a war-torn Valenhold, the streets choked with smoke, the sky blotted out by the wings of monstrous creatures. King Aldric stood atop the palace steps, the complete Eclipse Stone in his grasp, his laughter shaking the earth as cities crumbled. "This is the future if the stone is wielded by the unworthy," the keeper's voice whispered. Elara's heart pounded. This was no illusion. It was a vision of what would come. The scene shifted again, showing her a different path, the fragments hidden forever, but at the cost of Eldoria falling to a different tyranny, a slow rot seeping into the land. "There is no victory without sacrifice," the keeper said. "Choose." Elara swallowed hard. She knew what she had to do. "I'll take the fragment," she said. "Not to wield it, but to keep it from him." The keeper studied her, then nodded. The mist around the stone dissipated. As her fingers closed around the fragment, a searing pain shot up her arm, the stone's energy fusing with her very blood. The keeper's final words echoed as the cavern began to collapse. "The stone has chosen you." Now survive it. Chapter 9. Elara barely made it out of the cavern before the ceiling caved in, the force of the explosion sending her sprawling into the undergrowth. Kaela hauled her to her feet, her eyes widening at the sight of the fragment now embedded in Elara's palm, its edges fused to her skin like a grotesque jewel. "What did you do?" Kaela demanded, but there was no time to explain. The woods were shaking, the trees themselves seeming to recoil from the fragment's power. They ran, branches lashing at their faces, the whispers now screams of fury as the forest rejected the stone's presence. By the time they burst into the open air, Elara's vision was swimming, her veins burning as the fragment's energy coursed through her. She collapsed to her knees, gasping as images flooded her mind, the location of the third fragment, hidden in the heart of a dead city beneath the sea, the king's mages performing a ritual to track the very stone she now carried, and worst of all, a face, a man with golden eyes, watching her from the shadows of her thoughts. "He knows," Elara choked out. "The king knows I have it." Kaela's grip on her shoulder was iron. "Then we move faster." They scavenged supplies from an abandoned hunter's outpost, Kaela bundling Elara's trembling hand in cloth to mask the fragment's glow. As they mounted stolen horses, Elara forced herself to focus. The final fragment was the key. Without it, the king's power would remain incomplete. But the sea city of Vorin was a myth, a place said to have sunk beneath the waves in a forgotten cataclysm. "How do we reach a city that no longer exists?" Elara asked. Kaela's smile was grim. "We find the ones who remember it." She spurred her horse forward, and Elara followed, the fragment's weight a constant reminder. The king would hunt her to the ends of the earth, and the only way out was through. Chapter 10. The road to the coast was fraught with patrols, the king's soldiers now stationed at every crossroads, their banners bearing a new symbol, a black sun, the mark of the Eclipse Stone's influence. Elara and Kaela traveled by night, sticking to backroads and forests, but the fragment in Elara's hand was becoming harder to hide. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat, its energy whispering to her in dreams, showing her flashes of Vorin's drowned towers, of the third fragment resting atop an altar of coral and bone. Worse, the golden-eyed man from her visions began appearing in the waking world, a fleeting shadow at the edge of her sight, a figure standing atop distant cliffs, watching. Kaela dismissed it as exhaustion, but Elara knew better. Someone, or something, was tracking them. When they finally reached the port town of Selwyn, a place of salt-crusted docks and sailors with eyes full of superstition, Kaela sought out a one-eyed woman known as Mother Driftwood, a former navigator who spoke of Vorin as if it still stood. The city didn't sink, the old woman croaked, leading them to a back room filled with yellowed maps. "It was swallowed, and it returns when the tide calls it." She pointed to a chart marked with lunar cycles. In 3 nights, the tides would be at their lowest, and the ruins of Vorin would rise from the waves for a single day. "Many have tried to reach it," Mother Driftwood warned. "None have returned." Kaela traded their horses for a boat, its hull patched but seaworthy, and as they loaded supplies, Elara caught sight of a hooded figure standing at the end of the dock, golden eyes glinting in the dusk. This time, he didn't vanish. He raised a hand, as if in greeting, and the fragment in her palm burned like ice. She knew then, he would be waiting in Vorin. And whatever he wasn't human. Chapter 11. The boat cut through the choppy waters under a moonless sky, the only light coming from the faint, eerie glow of the fragment embedded in Elara's hand, its pulse steady like a second heartbeat. Kaela manned the oars with silent determination, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the outline of jagged spires had begun to emerge from the mist, Vorin, the drowned city, rising from the depths as the tides receded. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the water around them darkened, swirling with unseen currents that made the boat shudder. Elara's skin prickled with unease. The fragment's whispers had grown louder, forming words in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. "He is here," it murmured. "He has waited." Before she could warn Kaela, the boat lurched violently, nearly capsizing as something massive brushed against its hull. A shape broke the surface. A serpentine creature with scales like tarnished silver and eyes that glowed the same gold as the strangers. It circled them once before diving again, leaving the water unnervingly still. "We're not alone," Kaela hissed, her sword already drawn. The city loomed closer, its crumbling towers slick with seaweed, its streets flooded but passable, the cobblestones visible just beneath the shallow water. As they dragged the boat onto a half-submerged staircase, Elara's fragment flared with sudden intensity, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The golden-eyed man stood at the top of the stairs, his cloak dry despite the damp air, his smile revealing teeth too sharp to be human. "Welcome, bearer of the fragment," he said, his voice echoing as if spoken from the depths of the sea itself. "I am Dain, last of the Vorin's keepers. And you are trespassing." Chapter 12. Kaela stepped in front of Elara, her blade leveled at Dain. "Move," she snarled. The man, if he was a man, laughed, the sound like waves crashing against rocks. "You bring violence to a dead city," he said, tilting his head. "But it is not me you should fear." With a flick of his wrist, the water around them rippled, and from the flooded streets emerged figures, skeletal, draped in tattered robes, their eye sockets filled with the same golden light as Dain's. The drowned guardians of Vorin. Elara's fragment burned hotter, its energy surging through her veins, and without thinking, she raised her hand. A pulse of darkness erupted from it, striking the nearest guardian and reducing it to bone dust. Dain's amusement faded. "Interesting," he murmured. "The stone recognizes its air." Before Elara could process his words, Kaela charged, her sword clashing against an invisible barrier around Dain. The guardians surged forward, and Elara fought back with the fragment's power, each blast draining her, leaving her lightheaded. Dain watched, his golden eyes calculating, as if this were all some test. When only a few guardians remained, he raised a hand, freezing them in place. "Enough," he said. "You have proven your strength. But strength alone will not claim the final fragment." He turned, gesturing for them to follow. "The altar lies at the city's heart. If you seek it, you will face its trials. And you," he said, looking at Elara, "will learn what it truly means to bear the Eclipse Stone." Chapter 13. The path to the city's center was a labyrinth of half-drowned streets, the water growing shallower the deeper they went, as if Vorin was slowly exhaling after centuries underwater. Dain led them without speaking, his bare feet leaving no prints on the wet stone. The buildings here were better preserved, their facades carved with intricate murals depicting the Eclipse Stone's history, its creation, its fragmentation, and a warning: the one who wields it whole shall drown the world in shadow. Elara's stomach twisted. Was that the king's plan? Or hers, if she failed? The fragment in her hand throbbed in time with her steps, its whispers now a chorus of voices, some pleading, some furious. At last, they reached a circular plaza, its center dominated by a raised dais where the third fragment hovered above an altar, encased in a sphere of swirling water. Surrounding it were 7 statues, each representing a druid of old, their stone eyes seeming to track Elara's movements. "The trial of the tides," Dain announced. "To claim the fragment, you must prove your worthiness before the ancients." Kaela moved to step forward, but Dain blocked her. "Only the bearer may attempt this." Elara swallowed hard, her legs trembling as she approached the dais. The moment her foot touched the first step, the statues began to weep, not water, but blood, the crimson liquid pooling at the base of the altar. A voice boomed from nowhere and everywhere: "What will you sacrifice for the stone?" Chapter 14. Elara's breath caught as the question reverberated through her skull. The blood from the statues now formed words on the dais, shifting like live things: life, memory, soul, choose. She glanced back at Kaela, whose face was pale with dread, then at Dain, who watched with detached curiosity. The fragment in her palm seared her skin, as if urging her forward. "I don't understand," she whispered. The voice responded, softer now: "To wield the stone is to lose a part of yourself. What will you give? Elara thought of her grandmother, of Blackthorn's burning, of the king's twisted ambitions. She had already lost so much, but if she refused, all would be lost. Steeling herself, she placed her hand, the one without the fragment, onto the altar. Whatever it takes, she said. The blood surged upward, wrapping around her wrist like a vice. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through her arm, and when it receded, the skin was marked with jagged black runes, the same as those in the book. The water sphere around the third fragment shattered, and the shard flew to her, embedding itself in her other palm, the two fragments now connected by a thread of crackling energy. Dain exhaled sharply. It is done. The ground trembled as the statues crumbled, and the city let out a groan, the tide beginning to rise once more. Vorin returns to the sea, Dain said, grabbing Elara and Kaela and dragging them back toward the stairs. And you must return to the world, before the king comes for what you now carry. Chapter 15. The boat nearly capsized as the city sank behind them, the waves churning as if angry at their escape. Elara clutched her marked hand to her chest, the fragments in her palms humming in unison, their power intertwining with her blood. Kaela rode until her arms shook, her gaze flicking between Elara and the horizon where the first hints of dawn painted the sky. What did it cost you? She finally asked, her voice rough. Elara flexed her fingers, the runes pulsing. I don't know yet. Dain, who had appeared beside him as if summoned by the fragment's energy, studied her with something akin to pity. The marks are a covenant, he said. The stone will demand payment in time. Before Elara could demand answers, a shadow passed overhead, a massive raven, its feathers iridescent black, circling twice before diving toward the shore. Dain's expression darkened. The king's eyes are upon you. As the boat scraped onto the beach, the raven landed on a nearby rock, its beak opening to speak in a human voice. Aldric comes. Then it burst into flames, leaving only ashes. Kaela cursed, kicking sand over the embers. We need to move, now. Elara stared at the fragments in her hands, their power whispering of a final confrontation. The king would not stop until he had them, and she, marked, chosen, or cursed, would have to face him. The runes on her wrist burned, and for the first time, she heard the stone's voice clearly, prepare. Chapter 16. The weight of the Eclipse Stone fragments in Elara's palms was unbearable, a constant, searing reminder of the power she now carried, and the price she had yet to pay. The runes etched into her wrist pulsed with a life of their own, whispering in tongues older than the kingdom itself, their meaning just beyond her grasp. Kaela moved with a predator's grace through the dense undergrowth of the coastal forests, her sword unsheathed, her eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. Dain had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only a single, ominous warning: the king's mages will smell the fragments on you like blood in the water. Elara's breath came in ragged gasps as they climbed a steep ridge, the salt-laden wind biting at her face. Below them, the ruins of Vorin were gone, swallowed once more by the relentless sea, but the memory of the trial clung to her like a second skin. She could still feel the altar's cold embrace, the way the blood runes had carved themselves into her flesh as if claiming her. Kaela stopped abruptly at the ridge's peak, her body tensing. Gods below, she muttered. Elara followed her gaze. The valley beyond was a wasteland. Where once there had been rolling hills and farmland, now there was only scorched earth, the skeletal remains of trees jutting from the soil like broken fingers. At the center stood a makeshift fortress, its banners bearing the black sun of King Aldric's new order. And marching toward it, a column of soldiers dragging prisoners in chains. They're herding people, Kaela said, her voice tight with fury. Probably for another ritual. Elara's stomach turned. The king was growing desperate, his dark mages siphoning lives to fuel their search for the fragments. And now, with two of them fused to her very bones, she was a beacon. The fragments flared in response to her anger, their energy lashing out like a whip, scorching the ground at her feet. Kaela grabbed her shoulder. Control it, she hissed. or you'll lead 'em straight to us." But it was too late. A horn blared in the distance, and the soldiers' heads snapped toward the ridge. The hunt had begun. Chapter 17. They ran, the fragments glow betraying them with every step, their light cutting through the twilight like a torch. Behind them, the thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, the king's cavalry closing in. Kaela veered sharply into a narrow ravine, the walls so close they scraped Elara's arms as they squeezed through. The ravine opened into a hidden glen, its center dominated by the ruins of a druidic circle, moss-covered standing stones arranged in a pattern that mirrored the runes on Elara's wrist. She didn't need the fragment's whispers to know this place was significant. The air hummed with latent power, the very ground vibrating beneath her boots. Kaela barred the ravine's entrance with fallen branches, but it was a flimsy barrier at best. "We can't outrun 'em forever," she panted. "We need to fight." Elara stared at the standing stones, the fragments in her hands pulling her toward the circle's heart. As she stepped between the stones, the runes on her wrist ignited, the glow spreading up her arms like liquid fire. Vision slammed into her, druids chanting, the Eclipse Stone hole in their hands, the moment it was shattered to save the world from a tyrant no different from Aldric. "The circle remembers," a voice sighed in her mind. "It can hide you." Outside the circle, the first soldiers burst into the glen, their swords drawn. Kaela braced for combat, but Elara raised her hands, the fragment's energy surging through her. The standing stones trembled, then erupted with light, a barrier of searing energy sealing the glen. The soldiers recoiled, their horses rearing in panic. One man, braver or more foolish than the rest, charged the barrier, only to disintegrate mid-stride, his ashes scattering on the wind. The others froze. For now, they were safe. But the fragment's power was a wildfire in Elara's veins, and the runes on her wrist had spread to her elbows, their meaning finally clear: to wield the stone is to become its vessel. And vessels break. Chapter 18. The barrier held through the night, but Elara could feel its strength waning with every passing hour. The fragments demanded more than she could give, their hunger gnawing at her from the inside. Kaela paced the circle's edge, her sword never leaving her grip, her eyes darting between the trapped soldiers outside and Elara's deteriorating state. "We need a plan," she growled. "You can't even stand." Elara clenched her teeth, sweat dripping from her brow as she fought to keep the barrier intact. The runes had reached her shoulders now, their inky tendrils creeping toward her heart. She knew what they were, a countdown. The stone was claiming her, piece by piece. But there was still one fragment left, the largest, the one Aldric already possessed. And the visions the circle had shown her. "The king doesn't just want the stone," she gasped. "He wants to remake it, to undo the druid's work." Kaela's face darkened. "How?" Elara's breath hitched as another wave of pain racked her body. "The fragments aren't just broken pieces. They're seals, each one locked away part of the stone's original power. If he reunites them all." She didn't need to finish. The devastation would make Voren's drowning look like a ripple in a pond. Outside the barrier, the soldiers had been joined by a new figure, a mage, his robes embroidered with the black sun, his fingers crackling with unnatural energy. He pressed a hand to the barrier, and where he touched, the light flickered. Elara cried out, the pain unbearable. Kaela was at her side in an instant. "We can't stay here." Elara nodded weakly. "The last fragment, it's in Valenhold, in the king's throne room." Kaela's grip tightened. "Then we're going to the capital." With a final, agonized push, Elara pulled on the fragment's power, the barrier exploding outward in a shockwave that flattened the soldiers and sent the mage sprawling. The standing stones shattered in the backlash, their ancient magic spent. As the dust settled, Elara collapsed into Kaela's arms, the runes now brushing her collarbone. Somewhere, far away, Dain's voice echoed in her mind, "You cannot outrun the stone's will. But you can bend it to yours." Chapter 19. The road to Valenhold was a gauntlet. Every village they passed was either abandoned or occupied, the people hollow-eyed and fearful. King Aldric's influence had spread like a disease, his dark mages twisting the land to his will. Crops withered in the fields, rivers ran black, and the sky was perpetually overcast, the sun a faint smudge behind the clouds. Elara's condition worsened with each mile. The runes had reached her chest now, their tendrils spiderwebbing over her heart. The fragments in her palms were no longer separate entities but extensions of herself, their power humming in time with her pulse. Kaela scavenged a hooded cloak to hide Elara's glowing hands, but there was no disguising the otherworldly aura that clung to her. They traveled at night, sticking to the shadows, but twice they were forced to fight, once against a patrol of soldiers, and once against something far worse, a creature of smoke and gnashing teeth, summoned by the king's mages to track them. It fell only when Elara unleashed a fraction of the fragment's power, reducing it to ash. The effort left her vomiting blood by the roadside. Kaela's patience was wearing thin. "You're killing yourself," she snapped after the second attack. Elara wiped her mouth, her smile grim. "Better me than everyone else." As Valenhold's spires finally appeared on the horizon, the fragments reacted *, their energy surging toward the city like iron drawn to a magnet. The king's fragment was calling to them. Or perhaps it was the other way around. The gates were heavily guarded, the walls lined with archers, but none of that mattered. The runes had reached Elara's throat now, their whispers deafening. "Soon, * they promised. Soon it ends." Kaela gripped her arm. "However this goes, we do it together." Elara nodded, but she already knew the truth. This path led to a choice she alone could make. Chapter 20. The capital stank of fear and burning flesh. They slipped through the gates disguised as refugees, Elara's hood pulled low, her hands hidden in the folds of her cloak. The streets were patrolled not just by soldiers but by the king's mages, their faces hidden behind silver masks, their staves crackling with stolen energy. At the city's heart, the palace loomed, its towers clawing at the sky like talons. The fragments in Elara's palms burned hotter with every step, their pull irresistible. She could feel * the king's fragment, a malignant presence behind the palace walls, screaming to be reunited with its other halves. Kaela's contacts in the city's underground had provided a map of the palace's secret passages, but as they crouched in a sewer beneath the throne room, Elara knew stealth wouldn't be enough. The runes had reached her jawline now, their whispers a roar. "He knows you're here." * above them, the ground trembled, footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. Kaela drew her sword. Ready. Elara closed her eyes, letting the fragment's power flood her veins one last time. The runes completed their journey, meeting at her forehead in a searing burst of light. When she opened her eyes, the world was different. She could see the threads of magic woven through the palace, the cracks in the king's defenses. And she could see him *, Aldric, seated on his throne, the final fragment pulsing in his grip, his lips curled in a smile. "Come, little druid, * his voice slithered through her mind. "Let us end this." Elara exhaled. Then she shattered the sewer grate with a thought, and the palace erupted into chaos around them. Chapter 21. The throne room exploded into pandemonium as Elara and Kaela burst through the crumbling floor, the fragments in Elara's hands blazing like twin stars. King Aldric barely flinched, his gauntleted fingers tightening around the third fragment, a jagged obsidian shard twice the size of the others, its surface crawling with veins of crimson light. His once regal features were now sunken, his eyes hollow pits of hunger, his crown fused to his skull by the fragment's corrupting power. The air reeked of ozone and rotting flesh, the throne room's stained glass windows shattered, their shards floating in mid-air as if time itself had fractured. The king's mages lunged forward, their staves crackling with necrotic energy, but Kaela was already moving, her sword a silver blur as she carved through them with a feral precision. Elara barely registered the carnage. The fragments were screaming in her mind, their voices merging into a single, deafening command: reclaim. Reunite. Aldric rose from his throne, the ground trembling beneath him. "You've saved me the trouble of hunting you," he rasped, his voice layered with something inhuman. "Give me the fragments, girl, or watch your friend die screaming." As if on cue, the floating glass shards shifted, forming a razor-edged noose around Kaela's throat. Elara's breath hitched, but then the runes on her skin flared, their power surging through her in a wave of searing clarity. She understood now. The Eclipse Stone wasn't just a weapon. It was a key, and Aldric had no idea what he was truly wielding. Chapter 22. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Kaela's eyes locked onto Elara's, her blade still dripping with mage blood, her expression unreadable. The glass shards bit into her neck, drawing thin rivulets of crimson. Aldric's smile widened. "Choose." Elara let the fragment's power coil in her palms, but she didn't attack. Instead, she spoke *, her voice echoing with the weight of the runes now etched into her very bones. "You think you want the stone hole," she said, stepping forward. "But you don't know what it truly is." Aldric's confidence flickered. The third fragment in his grip pulsed erratically, as if agitated by her words. "Silence," he snarled, but Elara continued, her words laced with the knowledge the druids had buried. "The Eclipse Stone was never meant to be wielded. It was a lock, and the thing it's keeping sealed." She raised her hands, the fragment's light revealing the truth beneath Aldric's skin, tendrils of something other squirming beneath his flesh, something that recoiled from the light. The king staggered, his grip on the fragment faltering. "Lies," he roared, but the damage was done. The throne room's walls trembled, the floating glass shards clattering to the ground as his control wavered. Kaela didn't hesitate. She lunged, her sword aimed at Aldric's heart. But the king was faster. With a snarl, he yanked the third fragment toward his chest, its jagged edges piercing his armor, his skin, his ribs. Chapter 23. The world screamed. The moment the third fragment touched Aldric's blood, the air itself split open, a yawning void tearing through the throne room's ceiling. The fragments in Elara's hands wrenched violently, their pull nearly dislocating her shoulders as they strained toward their missing piece. Aldric's body convulsed, his back arching as the fragment burrowed deeper, his flesh splitting to accommodate it. The thing beneath his skin wreathed its true form beginning to emerge, a mass of pulsating darkness, its surface studded with eyes that wept black tears. Kaela stumbled back, her sword arm shaking. Gods above, Elara's runes burned white-hot, the pain nearly blinding her. The Eclipse Stone wasn't just reuniting. It was waking up, and the thing it had been locking away was using Aldric as a conduit. The void above them pulsed, tendrils of shadow lashing down, reducing stone and steel to dust. The king's voice, when he spoke, was no longer his own. "Flesh is a prison," it gurgled through Aldric's ruined throat. The key turns. The door opens. Elara knew then that killing Aldric wouldn't be enough. The fragments had to be separated again, no matter the cost. She turned to Kaela, her vision swimming. "When I give the signal," she gasped, "cut the king's hand off." Kaela's grip on her sword tightened. "And you?" Elara didn't answer. The runes had reached her temples now, their message clear: the lock requires a keyholder. Chapter 24. Chaos erupted as the throne room collapsed around them. Aldric, or the thing wearing Aldric, lashed out with tendrils of living shadow, carving through stone and flesh alike. Elara dodged, the fragments in her hands blazing as she channeled their power into a shield, deflecting a blow that would have cleaved Kaela in two. The void above them yawned wider, its edges crackling with stolen energy. Every second the fragments remained near each other, the thing from beyond the lock grew stronger. Elara could feel it scratching at the edges of her mind, whispering promises of power, of freedom, of an end to pain. She gritted her teeth and charged. Aldric's corrupted form swung at her, but she rolled beneath the attack, slamming her palm, and the fragment fused to it, against his chest. The reaction was instantaneous. The fragments recognized each other. Light and shadow warred beneath Aldric's skin, his body convulsing as the two forces tore him apart from the inside. Now, Elara screamed. Kaela's sword flashed. Aldric's hand, still clutching the third fragment, hit the ground with a wet thud. The king's shriek of rage shook the crumbling palace, but Elara was already moving. She grabbed the severed hand, her own fragments flaring as she wrenched the third shard free. The moment it touched her skin, it fused asterisk, the pain so vast she couldn't even scream. The Eclipse Stone was whole again, and it was tearing her apart. Chapter 25. The world dissolved into light and agony. Elara's body was no longer her own. It was a battleground, the Eclipse Stone's power raging through her veins as it fought to reunite fully. The void above pulsed hungrily, its tendrils reaching for her. The thing that had worn Aldric like a suit staggered, its form unraveling without the third fragment to anchor it. "You cannot hold it," asterisk it hissed, its voice fading as the lock resealed. "You will break, and we will feast." Elara barely heard it. The runes had covered her entirely now, the glow so bright it seared her vision. She could feel the stone's will pressing against hers, demanding surrender. But she'd made her choice. With a final, shuddering breath, she pulled. The fragments resisted, their edges screaming as they began to separate, but she was the keyholder now. The lock demanded sacrifice, and she gave it. The explosion of light shattered the palace's remains, the force hurling Kaela back into the rubble. When the dust settled, the void was gone. The thing that had worn Aldric was gone. And Elara knelt amidst the wreckage, her body trembling, the fragments once again split. But the cost was etched into her skin. The runes had turned to scars, and the Eclipse Stone's whispers, they were now hers asterisk to bear. Alone. Chapter 25. The weight of the fractured Eclipse Stone fragments in Elara's palms had diminished to a dull, throbbing ache, the once blinding light now reduced to a faint, erratic pulse beneath her scarred skin. The ruins of Valenhold's palace stretched around her in a grotesque tableau of shattered stone and twisted metal, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood. Kaela stirred amidst the rubble a few yards away, her sword still clutched in her white-knuckle grip, her face streaked with dirt and blood as she pushed herself upright with a pained grunt. The silence that had fallen over the capital was unnatural, oppressive, even the wind had stilled, as if the world itself was holding its breath in the aftermath of what had transpired. Elara's body protested as she forced herself to stand, her muscles screaming in protest, her vision swimming dangerously as the full weight of what she had done settled over her like a shroud. The Eclipse Stone was no longer whole, its fragments once again separated, their power contained, but the cost was etched into her very being. The runes that had once burned with such intensity were now pale, jagged scars that covered every inch of her skin, their once vibrant glow reduced to a faint, ghostly shimmer that pulsed in time with her slowing heartbeat. Kaela reached her side, her grip on Elara's arm tight enough to bruise as she steadied her. "You look like death," she muttered, her voice rough with exhaustion, but there was something beneath the weariness, something like awe, or perhaps fear. Elara didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the ruins around them. The throne was gone, reduced to little more than a pile of smoldering rubble, and Aldric, what was left of him, was nowhere to be seen. The thing that had worn him like a suit had vanished the moment the fragments were separated, its hold on the world severed, but Elara could still feel the echo of its presence, like the memory of a nightmare that refused to fade. The people of Valenhold would emerge soon, hesitant and shell-shocked, their king gone, their city in ruins. There would be chaos in the days to come, a power vacuum that would no doubt be filled by those hungry for control, but that was a problem for another time. For now, there was only the quiet, the dust settling, the first tentative rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds that had choked the sky for so long. Kaela exhaled sharply, her grip tightening. What now? Elara flexed her fingers, the fragments beneath her skin pulsing faintly in response. The whispers were still there, quieter now, but insistent. The Eclipse Stone was not done with her, would never be done with her. She was its keyholder, its guardian, and its burden was hers to bear until her last breath. "Now," she said, her voice little more than a whisper, "we survive." And with that, she took the first step forward, into the ruins of the world she had saved, and the uncertain future that lay beyond. Epilogue. The village at the edge of the Whispering Woods was small, insignificant, the kind of place that history forgot. The villagers went about their lives with quiet determination, their days filled with the mundane rhythms of farming and trade, their nights spent huddled around hearths, whispering stories of the world beyond their borders. Few travelers passed through, and those who did rarely stayed long. The two women who arrived at the height of summer were no exception. The taller one, her face sharp with the remnants of old scars, spoke little, her hand never far from the hilt of the sword at her hip. The other, her features obscured by the hood of her worn cloak, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her hands, marked with strange, pale scars, always tucked carefully into the folds of her sleeves. They took up residence in an abandoned cottage at the village's edge, its roof sagging but intact, its walls sturdy enough to keep out the worst of the wind. The villagers left them to their solitude, sensing something in the air around them, something that warned against prying. If they noticed the way the woman with the scarred hands sometimes stared into the distance, her gaze fixed on something only she could see, they said nothing. If they heard the whispers that sometimes seeped from the cottage in the dead of night, voices that were not voices murmuring in a language that twisted the air, they pretended otherwise. And if, on the darkest nights, a faint, pulsing light could be seen through the cracks in the cottage's shutters, a light that shimmered like the memory of a dying star, they turned away, pulled their blankets tighter, and told themselves it was only the fire. The world had been saved. But some things were never meant to be forgotten. Chapter 26. The weight of the Eclipse Stone fragments had settled into Elara's bones like a second skeleton, their presence a constant hum beneath her scarred skin as she and Kaela moved through the dense undergrowth at the edge of the Whispering Woods. The villagers' stares burned against her back long after they'd left the settlement behind, their whispers slithering through the trees like adders. "They know," Kaela muttered, her sword hand twitching toward the hilt of her blade as a branch snapped somewhere in the gloom ahead. Elara didn't need to ask what she meant. The way the villagers' eyes had lingered on her scarred hands, the way the children had scampered indoors when she passed, spoke louder than any accusation. The fragments pulsed in response to her unease, their energy coiling like restless serpents beneath her flesh. The forest around them grew denser, the ancient oaks twisting into grotesque shapes as the sunlight faded to a sickly green glow filtering through the canopy. This deep in the woods, the air tasted of rust and rotting leaves, each breath coating Elara's tongue with the metallic tang of old magic. Kaela's boots sank into the spongy earth with a wet squelch as they reached the clearing, the same one where their journey had truly begun, the standing stones now little more than shattered stumps jutting from the ground. Like broken teeth, the remnants of druidic power still clung to the place, a static charge that raised the hairs on Elara's arms as she knelt, pressing her palms to the damp soil. The fragments flared in response, their light bleeding through her scars to paint the ground in shifting patterns. "It's still here," she breathed, the realization settling over her like a shroud. The Eclipse Stone's corruption had seeped into the land itself, a poison spreading through root and rock. The vision came without warning, the forest withering, the villages crumbling to dust, the fragments in her hands screaming as the lock they'd fought so hard to preserve splintered apart. Kaela's grip on her shoulder was the only thing that kept her from sinking into the vision completely. "What did you see?" Elara's voice was raw when she answered. "It's not over." The fragments burned hotter, their whispers rising to a crescendo as the first howl split the twilight, long, mournful, and utterly unnatural. The trees shuddered as something moved in the shadows, something that walked on too many legs, its breath rattling like dry leaves in a gale. Kaela's sword sang as she drew it, her body tensing for the fight to come. Elara rose slowly, the fragments light spreading up her arms like liquid fire as the thing in the woods began to laugh. The sound was wrong, a grotesque parody of human mirth that set Elara's teeth on edge. The Eclipse Stone's voice joined it, whispering from the depths of her mind. "You thought you won, asterisk," it crooned, the words dripping with malicious amusement. "But the lock was never meant to hold forever." Asterisk. The undergrowth parted, and the thing stepped into the clearing, its form shifting, unstable, as if it couldn't decide what shape to wear. One moment it was a man with golden eyes, the next a mass of writhing shadows, the next something else entirely. It smiled with too many teeth. "Hello again, keyholder." The fragments screamed in Elara's hands as the world tilted, the ground beneath them cracking open to reveal the yawning darkness below. Chapter 27. The earth gave way beneath them with a sound like splintering bone, the forest floor collapsing into a cavern that stank of wet stone and something far worse. Elara's stomach lurched as she fell, the fragments in her hands blazing like miniature suns as she tumbled through the darkness. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, the impact sending jagged bolts of pain up her spine. Kaela landed beside her with a grunt, her sword still clutched in one white-knuckled hand. The thing, the golden-eyed man, the shadow, whatever it was, stood watching them from across the cavern, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The walls around them pulsed with the same sickly light as Elara's scars, the stone veined with glowing tendrils that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The air was thick with the Eclipse Stone's energy, so potent it burned her throat with every breath. "You should have let the lock break," the thing said, its voice weaving through the cavern like smoke. "It would have been quicker." Kaela surged to her feet, her blade slicing through the air where the thing's throat should have been, but it was no longer there. Its laughter echoed from everywhere and nowhere, the sound slithering over Elara's skin like a physical touch. The fragments in her hands burned hotter, their light flaring as the cavern walls began to shift, the stone melting like wax to reveal something vast and pulsing beneath. The lock, the real lock, not the Eclipse Stone, but what it had been meant to contain. The thing's voice was a whisper in her ear now, its breath cold against her neck. "You can still walk away. Let the next generation deal with the consequences." Elara's hands trembled as she raised them, the fragments light illuminating the horror before her, the true face of what they'd fought so hard to contain. The thing smiled, its golden eyes reflecting the glow of her scars. "Or you can do what you do best. Break yourself trying to save a world that will never thank you." Kaela's hand found hers, her grip iron strong. The fragments pulsed between them, their light merging, growing. Elara made her choice. Chapter 28. The cavern erupted in light as the fragments' power surged, the energy pouring from Elara's hands in a torrent that seared her skin and boiled the air around them. The thing's scream was lost in the deafening roar as the lock shuddered, its surface cracking like thin ice beneath their feet. Kaela's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. "Elara, stop. You're killing yourself." But it was too late. The fragments were burning through her now, their power consuming her from the inside out as she poured everything she had into the lock. The thing's form twisted, its edges fraying as the light tore into it, its golden eyes wide with something almost like fear. "You fool," it hissed, its voice breaking apart. "You'll doom us all." The last thing Elara saw before the world went white was Kaela's face, her mouth forming words lost in the cacophony, then nothing. Chapter 29. The darkness was absolute. Elara floated in it, weightless, untethered. There was no pain here, no fear, no fragments whispering in her mind. Just quiet. Then, a pulse of light, faint at first, then stronger, rhythmic. A heartbeat. The fragments stirred in her hands, their presence fainter now, but still there. Still hers. The darkness receded in increments, revealing a world remade. The cavern was gone. The forest was gone. She stood on a vast plain beneath a sky the color of fresh bruises, the air thick with the scent of lightning and wet earth. Before her, the lock stood whole and unbroken, but different now. Changed. The thing was nowhere to be seen. Kaela lay a few feet away, her chest rising and falling steadily, her sword still clutched in her hand. The fragments in Elara's palms were quiet, their light dimmed but steady. The scars on her skin had faded to pale silver, their whispers silent at last. For now. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, they would be ready. Chapter 30. The first raindrops struck Elara's face like cold needles as she helped Kaela to her feet, the fragments in her hands humming softly in response to the shifting air. The plain stretched endlessly around them, the grass whispering secrets as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something old and powerful stirring on the horizon. Kaela's fingers brushed against the fresh scars on Elara's arms, her touch feather-light. "What did you do?" Elara watched the storm clouds gather, their bellies heavy with promised violence. The fragments pulsed in time with the distant thunder, their energy no longer a burden, but a covenant. "What I had to." The first bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the path ahead, a road that would take them far from this place, toward battles yet to come, toward locks yet to be sealed. The fragments' whispers rose again, softer now, but insistent. Elara smiled. Somewhere in the darkness, the thing with the golden eyes laughed. The game was far from over. Chapter 31. The storm broke over the plains with a violence that shook the earth, rain slashing sideways in sheets as lightning tore the sky apart again and again. Elara's soaked clothing clung to her scarred skin as she trudged forward, the fragments in her palms burning with each step as though they were being freshly branded into her flesh. Kaela moved like a shadow at her side, her sword drawn though there was nothing visible to fight, yet. The air itself tasted charged, thick with the tang of iron and something darker, something that made the fragments pulse in warning. The landscape around them had changed since the cavern, where there should have been the familiar forests of Eldoria's borderlands stretched an endless sea of swaying grass, each blade tipped with unnatural silver that caught the lightning in eerie flashes. The ground beneath their feet was too soft, giving way like rotted fruit with each step, the mud sucking at their boots with wet, hungry sounds. In the distance, barely visible through the curtain of rain, stood the outline of a structure, low and sprawling, its walls constructed of some dark material that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The fragments in Elara's hands flared as they drew nearer, their light revealing the truth the rain tried to obscure. The building wasn't stone or wood, but something organic, something that pulsed faintly as though breathing. The door, if it could be called that, was a yawning mouth of jagged protrusions that parted with a wet, tearing sound as they approached. The smell that rolled out was beyond decay. It was the stench of something that had never been meant to exist in this world, something that violated the very air it touched. Kaela's grip on her sword tightened until the leather of her gloves creaked. "We shouldn't go in there." The fragments burned hotter in agreement, but Elara was already moving forward, her body no longer entirely her own to control. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent, not just from the fragments, but from the walls themselves, from the thing that waited in the darkness beyond that terrible doorway. The interior was worse than she could have imagined. The walls were lined with pulsing veins that throbbed in time with the fragments' glow, the ceiling dripping with thick, viscous fluid that sizzled where it struck the floor. At the center of the chamber stood a figure, or something that had once been a figure, its form shifting between human and something decidedly not, its flesh bubbling and reforming like wax held too close to flame. When it turned, Elara saw that its face was a shifting mosaic of every person she'd ever failed, every life the Eclipse Stone had touched and ruined. Its mouth stretched into a smile too wide for any human face. "Keyholder," it breathed, and the voice was a chorus of the dead. "We've been waiting." The fragments screamed in her hands as the thing stepped forward, its shadow stretching and twisting across the writhing walls. Behind her, Kaela swore violently, but Elara couldn't turn, couldn't move. The thing had her now, its gaze locking hers as the past and present and future collapsed together in a single, terrible moment of understanding. The Eclipse Stone had never been the lock. She had, and it was time to fulfill her purpose. Chapter 32. The realization struck Elara like a physical blow. The fragments weren't pieces of a lock, but pieces of herself, scattered across time and space to keep the darkness at bay. The thing's laughter shook the chamber, the walls trembling as its form expanded, its edges bleeding into the shadows until it was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Kaela's sword passed through it harmlessly, the steel ringing as it struck the pulsating wall instead. Elara. Kaela's voice was raw with panic, but Elara couldn't respond, her throat sealed shut by an invisible force as the thing's fingers, if they could be called fingers, brushed against her forehead. The fragments in her hands blazed white-hot, their light piercing through the chamber's gloom to reveal the terrible truth etched into the walls, not veins, but chains, countless chains stretching into the darkness, each one connected to a version of herself frozen in endless agony. The thing's breath was ice against her ear. You see now, don't you? How many times you've done this? How many times you've failed? The fragments pulsed in time with her racing heart, their light flickering as the memories flooded in, 1,000 lifetimes, 1,000 battles, 1,000 failures. Each time, the darkness had gotten a little stronger. Each time, she'd remembered a little less. Until now, Kaela's hand closed around her wrist, her grip bruising. Fight it. The thing's laughter redoubled, the sound driving nails of ice into Elara's skull. What's the point? The cycle just continues. The lock always breaks. The darkness always wins. The fragments flared in Elara's hands, their light intensifying as something within her, something deeper than memory, older than pain, stirred. The thing recoiled, its form rippling like disturbed water. No, not this time. The voice that came from Elara's mouth wasn't entirely her own. It was layered with the echoes of every version of herself that had come before, every sacrifice, every loss. The fragment's light shifted, no longer white but gold, the chains on the walls trembling as the power built, as the truth settled into her bones. The Eclipse Stone had never been the lock. She had, and a lock could be opened as well as closed. The thing screamed as the light reached critical mass, its form unraveling at the edges as the chamber shook apart around them. Kaela's arms wrapped around Elara as the world dissolved into light and chaos, her voice the only anchor in the storm. Whatever you're doing, hurry. The fragments burned away to nothing in Elara's hands, their power merging with hers as the final realization struck, she wasn't the lock. She was the key, and it was time to turn. Chapter 33 The explosion of light seared the darkness from the world. The thing's screams cut short as the chamber, the building, the very air around them, disintegrated into swirling motes of golden light. Elara's knees hit solid ground, the fragments gone from her hands but their power still coursing through her veins, her scars glowing faintly in the sudden silence. The plains were gone. The storm was gone. They knelt in the center of a vast, circular chamber of pristine white stone, the walls lined with archways that stretched into impossible distances, each one framing a different time, a different place. Kaela sucked in a sharp breath as she took in their surroundings, her sword hanging useless at her side. Where? The answer came not in words, but in understanding. This was the heart of it all, the place between places, the locus where all the locks connected. And standing before them, his golden eyes wide with shock, was Dain. He looked different here, not the ragged wanderer they'd met in Vorin, but something sharper, brighter, his edges defined by the same golden light that now pulsed through Elara's scars. You weren't supposed to remember, he breathed, taking an involuntary step back. None of you ever remember. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. Dain wasn't just a keeper. He was the first, the original, the one who had started the cycle by breaking the lock himself. Elara's voice was steady despite the fury boiling in her chest. How long? Dain's face twisted through a dozen emotions before settling on weary resignation. Long enough to know it doesn't matter. The darkness always gets out. The locks always fail. He gestured to the archways around them, each one showing a different version of the same story, Elara and Kaela, fighting and failing in endless variations. I've watched it happen 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. The only thing that changes is how many people die before it's over. Kaela's sword was at his throat before he could blink, her eyes blazing. You bastard, you've been setting us up to fail. Dain didn't flinch. I've been giving you a chance to succeed. This time was different. This time, she remembered. His gaze locked with Elara's, something like hope flickering in those golden depths. You can end it, really end it, but the cost, Elara already knew. The fragments had shown her. To truly seal the darkness away meant becoming part of the lock, not just in this lifetime, but in all of them. Past, present, future. It meant sacrificing not just herself, but every version of herself that had ever been or would be. Kaela's grip on her arm was painful. No, there has to be another way. Dain's smile was bitter. There isn't. I've looked. The archways around them pulsed, the images shifting to show the darkness breaking free, world after world crumbling to ash. Elara met Kaela's gaze, saw the refusal there, the desperation, and made her choice. Chapter 34. The chamber shook as Elara reached for the power thrumming in her scars, the golden light intensifying until it drowned out everything else. Dain's shout of alarm was lost in the roar as the archways began to collapse inward, their edges fraying like burning parchment. Kaela's grip on her arm tightened to the point of pain, her voice cutting through the chaos. Elara, don't you dare. But it was too late. The decision had been made the moment she understood the truth. She wasn't just a key. She was the only key. The light surged outward in a blinding wave, the archways shattering as the power tore through them, rewriting the pattern of the locks, reforging the chain that bound the darkness. The screams of 1,000 versions of herself echoed in her skull as the pieces snapped into place, the cost exacted in blood and memory and time. When the light faded, they stood once more in the whispering woods, the familiar trees swaying gently in the afternoon sun. No ruins, no fragments, no scars. Kaela stared at her with dawning horror. What did you do? Elara flexed her unmarked hands. The absence of the fragments weighed both relief and loss. What I had to. The woods around them was silent, no whispers, no golden-eyed watches, no sense of impending doom. Just peace. Dain was gone. The thing was gone. The lock held. For now. Kaela's voice was rough. Is it over? Elara turned her face to the sun, feeling the warmth on her skin for the first time in what felt like forever. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, the faintest echo of a whisper remained, a reminder that locks could be broken. Keys could be turned, and darkness was patient. She took Kaela's hand, squeezing gently. For now, the path ahead was empty, the future unwritten. And for the first time since she'd taken up the fragment's burden, that was enough. Chapter 35. The village at the edge of the woods had changed in their absence. New buildings, new faces, the scars of past battles healed over by time and growth. The villagers eyed them with curiosity rather than fear as they passed through the gates, their whispers carrying on the wind. Travelers, someone murmured, must be seeking work. Kaela's lips quirked in something almost like a smile as she adjusted the pack on her shoulders. Think they'll let us stay this time? Elara didn't answer, her gaze drawn to the horizon where the first hints of twilight painted the sky. The fragments were gone, their power spent, their purpose fulfilled, but the lock remained. And so did she. The innkeeper was a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who took one look at their worn clothing and offered them a room in exchange for help with the harvest. It was a fair trade. As night fell and the village quieted, Elara stood at the window, watching the stars emerge one by one. Kaela's arms wrapped around her from behind, her chin resting on Elara's shoulder. You're thinking too loud. Elara leaned into the contact, the warmth of it chasing away the last of the lingering chill. Just wondering what comes next. Kaela huffed a laugh against her neck. Whatever we want. The simplicity of it was almost painful. No fragments, no destiny, just life. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something that might have been laughter, or just the echoes of a past already fading into legend. Elara closed her eyes and let it go. The lock held, the darkness slept, and for the first time in countless lifetimes, the future was theirs to shape. Chapter 36. The first tendrils of unease curled through Elara's stomach 3 days after their arrival in the village, a subtle wrongness that slithered between her ribs like a living thing. She stood in the pre-dawn gloom of the inn's kitchen, kneading dough with hands that still ached from phantom fragments, her skin prickling with the weight of unseen eyes. The hearth fire spat an ember onto the stone floor, its glow revealing what daylight hid, the faintest silver tracing of scars just beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the light struck them at the right angle. Kaela's shadow filled the doorway before her voice did, rough with sleep and something darker. Dreamt of the ruins again. The admission hung between them, weighted with all they didn't say. Elara's fingers stilled in the dough, the flour dusting her wrists like ash. Which ones? Kaela's sword lay across the table between them, its edge catching the firelight in a way that made the metal seem to ripple like water. The ones we haven't found yet. Outside, the village rooster crowed, the sound strangled and too early. The bread dough beneath Elara's palms pulsed once, warm as living flesh, before settling back into an inert mass. When she looked up, Kaela's reflection in the blackened kitchen knife showed eyes too old for her face, pupils dilated wide enough to swallow the world. Chapter 37. The stranger arrived at the height of the harvest festival, his cloak the color of dried blood and his boots too clean for the muddy lanes. Elara felt him before she saw him, a pressure behind her eyes like thumbs pressing against her optic nerves. The village square bustled with laughter and fiddle music, children weaving between tables laden with autumn's bounty, but the air around the stranger warped like heat haze off desert stones. Kaela's hand found the small of Elara's back, her fingers forming the old battle sign against her spine. Ambush. Flanking positions. The stranger removed his wide-brimmed hat with a flourish, revealing a face that shifted between familiar and foreign with each blink, a merchant's round cheeks, a soldier's scarred brow, a priest's beatific smile, all layered over something far less human. His voice, when he spoke, dripped honeyed poison. Ladies, fancy meeting you here. The festival's noise continued around them, oblivious, but Elara's world narrowed to the space between his two white teeth where shadows pulled like old blood. Kaela's knife was already in her hand, the blade reflecting not the noonday sun but the cavern's endless dark where they'd made their stand. The stranger laughed, and the sound unspooled memories Elara had buried, Dain's golden eyes, the lock's screaming faces, the way her bones had sung as they broke under the fragment's power. Come now, he chided, reaching into his cloak. Is this any way to greet an old friend? What he withdrew wasn't a weapon but a book, its leather binding cracked with age, its pages whispering as they shifted. Elara's breath caught. She knew that book, had burned it herself in another life. The stranger's smile widened as he ran a finger down its spine, the motion obscenely intimate. You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you? Chapter 38. The inn's back room stank of mildew and old wine, the single guttering candle casting long shadows that twitched like hanged men dancing. Elara traced the book's cover with fingers that remembered holding a quill, signing her name in ink that had bubbled and burned. Kaela paced the narrow confines like a caged wolf, her boot heels striking the floorboards in time with the stranger's ragged breathing. He lay bound in the corner, his glamour fading with each passing moment to reveal the ruin beneath. His true face was a mosaic of broken things, a soldier's shattered nose, a scholar's ruined eyes, a thief's missing ear, all stitched together with threads of glistening darkness that squirmed when prodded. Elara forced the book open, its pages crackling with malignant energy, the words rearranging themselves before her eyes. It's a ledger, she murmured, her throat tightening around the realization. Of every life the lock has touched. The stranger's laugh bubbled with fluid, not just touched, sweetling, consumed. His bound hands twitched toward the book, the fingers elongating, the nails blackening. You broke the cycle but not the hunger. The darkness always hungers. Kaela's knife found his throat, the blade singing as it pressed into flesh that parted like overripe fruit. Where did you get this? The thing wearing a man's skin grinned, its teeth lengthening. From the same place you'll be returning it. The candle flared suddenly blue, It's like catching on something moving beneath the stranger's skin, a familiar, pulsing darkness. Elara's hands ached with remembered weight. The fragments were gone. The lock was sealed, but something had gotten out. Chapter 39. The cellar beneath the inn was older than the village, its rough-hewn stones weeping moisture that glistened like oil in the torchlight. Elara pressed her palm to the wall and felt the answering thrum of power, the same energy that had coursed through the fragments, the lock, the countless battles before. The stranger's laughter followed them down the stairs, his voice shifting registers with each step, now a child's whimper, now a crone's cackle, now the wet gurgle of a drowning man. Kaela's torch guttered as they reached the bottom, the flame shrinking to a desperate blue ember that revealed the truth the village had been built to hide. The walls weren't stone but bone, the floor not dirt but compacted ash, and at the center of it all stood an altar of blackened wood, its surface carved with runes that matched Elara's long-vanished scars. The book in her hands grew heavier, its pages fluttering as though caught in a phantom wind. The stranger's bonds had rotted away upstairs, his body collapsing into a swarm of skittering shadows that now pulled at the base of the altar, reforming into something taller, sharper, its edges bleeding into the darkness. "You really should have checked the foundations," it purred, its voice the scrape of steel on bone. Kaela's sword was in her hand, but the runes along the blade, once dormant, now glowed the same sickly green as the thing's eyes. Elara's breath fogged in the sudden cold as understanding dawned. The village wasn't a sanctuary. It was a seal, and they'd just broken it. Chapter 40. The first scream from above was a woman's, high and panicked, cut abruptly short. The second was a child's. By the third, the cellar stairs had collapsed, sealing them in with the thing that wore the stranger's smile like a ill-fitting mask. The book in Elara's hands burned with cold fire, its pages peeling back to reveal an illustration that hadn't been there before, the village in flames, its people twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves, and at the center, two figures, one with a sword of green flame, one with hands full of dying light. The thing circled them, its form shifting with each pass, now a wolf with too many eyes, now a writhing mass of limbs, now a mirror image of Elara herself, scars and all. The lock was never just yours, it crooned, trailing fingers of smoke along the bone walls. Every generation provides a new keyholder, a new sacrifice. Kaela's sword flared brighter, the runes searing her hands where she gripped the hilt, but she didn't drop it. "Then we'll break the cycle for good." The thing's laughter shook dust from the ceiling. "Oh, my dear wolf, you don't break cycles." It lunged, its form exploding into a cloud of grasping shadows. "You become them." Elara's hands remembered the weight of fragments as she reached for the altar, for the power thrumming beneath its surface, for the last desperate chance to seal what should have stayed buried. The darkness welcomed her like an old friend. Chapter 41. The darkness embraced Elara like a lover's arms, thick and suffocating, pressing against her skin with a weight that made her bones ache. The thing's laughter echoed around her, not from any one direction but from everywhere at once, vibrating through the cellar's bone walls and up through the soles of her boots. The book in her hands had grown hot enough to blister her palms, its pages now writhing as if alive, the ink rearranging itself into words she couldn't read but understood all the same, a history of every keyholder who had come before her, every sacrifice made to keep the lock sealed, every failure that had led to this moment. Kaela's sword cut through the shadows with a hiss, the green flame along its edge casting grotesque, flickering shapes against the walls, but the thing simply reformed around each strike, its laughter growing louder with every failed attempt. "You can't kill what's already dead," it taunted, its voice now a chorus of every person Elara had ever lost, every voice that haunted her dreams. The altar at the center of the room pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light, like a heartbeat, its runes glowing faintly in response to the book's presence. Elara's fingers twitched with the memory of the fragments, the scars they had left behind still echoing in her flesh even if the marks themselves were gone. She knew what she had to do. The darkness wasn't just in the cellar or the village, it was in her, had always been in her, coiled tight around her soul like a second shadow. The thing lunged again, this time aiming for Kaela, its form solidifying into something clawed and snarling, but Elara was already moving, throwing herself between them, the book pressed to her chest like a shield. The impact drove the air from her lungs, the thing's claws raking deep furrows across her back, but she barely felt the pain. The book was burning now, its pages blackening at the edges, the words within screaming as they were consumed. The thing recoiled, its form rippling in agitation. "You fool," it hissed, its voice laced with something almost like fear. "That book is the only thing keeping the lock from crumbling entirely." Elara's vision swam, the darkness at the edges of her sight creeping inward, but she forced herself to stay upright, her fingers tightening around the book. "Then it's a good thing I don't need it anymore," she gasped, and with a final, wrenching effort, she tore the book in half. The sound that followed was like the world itself splitting apart, a deafening crack that shook the cellar to its foundations, the bone walls splintering, the altar erupting in a geyser of black flame. The thing screamed, its form unraveling at the edges, its voice rising to a pitch that made Elara's ears bleed. Kaela was at her side in an instant, her sword abandoned, her hands gripping Elara's shoulders as the darkness surged around them, the cellar collapsing in on itself. The last thing Elara saw before the world went black was the thing's golden eyes, wide with fury and something else, something almost like respect, before it too was swallowed by the void. Chapter 42. Consciousness returned in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly being pieced back together. Elara's body ached as if she'd been trampled by horses, her skin slick with sweat and something thicker, darker. The air stank of smoke and burnt flesh, the taste of it coating her tongue like ash. She was lying on cold stone, the surface uneven beneath her, and when she forced her eyes open, the sight that greeted her was one of utter ruin. The cellar was gone, reduced to little more than a crater in the earth, the walls collapsed inward, the altar nothing but smoldering wreckage. The village above had fared no better, what remained of the inn was a skeleton of blackened timbers, the sky beyond choked with smoke. Kaela lay beside her, her face streaked with soot and blood, her breathing shallow but steady. The book was gone, reduced to cinders, but the thing was nowhere to be seen. Elara's hands trembled as she pushed herself upright, her muscles screaming in protest. The darkness that had clung to her for so long was gone, its weight lifted, but in its place was something else, a hollowness, like a part of her had been carved out and discarded. Kaela stirred, her eyelids fluttering open, her gaze sharpening as it landed on Elara. "Did we win?" she croaked, her voice raw. Elara opened her mouth to answer, but the words died in her throat as a sound cut through the silence, a slow, deliberate clapping. Her head snapped up, her heart lurching against her ribs. At the edge of the crater stood a figure, his form wreathed in shadows, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Dain," he smiled, the expression devoid of warmth. "Not bad," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "But the game's far from over." Kaela was on her feet in an instant, her sword somehow back in her hand despite the destruction around them. "You bastard," she snarled. "You set this up." Dain's smile didn't waver. "I gave you a chance to prove yourselves," he corrected. "And you did, admirably." He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the debris. "But the lock is more than one village, one book, one keyholder. It's a living thing, and it's hungry." Elara's hands curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. "What do you want?" Dain's gaze locked onto hers, his golden eyes boring into her soul. "The same thing I've always wanted," he said softly. "To see if you're strong enough to do what needs to be done." And with that, he turned, his form dissolving into the smoke, leaving him alone in the ruins of yet another battle. The wind howled through the shattered remains of the village, carrying with it the faintest whisper of laughter, or maybe it was just the echoes of the dead. Kaela's grip on her sword tightened. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice hollow. Elara didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The lock was breaking. The darkness was waking. and they were the only ones left to stand in its way. Chapter 43. The road out of the ruined village was eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife absent, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. Elara's steps were slow, measured, her body still protesting every movement, but she refused to stop. Behind them, the smoke from the burning village stained the horizon, a dark smudge against the pale dawn sky. Kaela walked beside her, her sword strapped to her back, her expression unreadable. They had salvaged what little they could from the wreckage, a waterskin, a handful of dried meat, a tattered cloak, but the book was gone, and with it, any hope of understanding the full extent of the lock's reach. Elara's hands itched for the weight of the fragments, for the power they had granted her, but they were gone, truly gone this time, and all that remained was the hollow ache of their absence. The landscape around them was unfamiliar, the rolling hills giving way to dense forest, the trees towering and ancient, their gnarled roots twisting across the path like grasping fingers. The air here was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Kaela's hand drifted to her sword hilt, her eyes scanning the shadows. "This place feels wrong," she muttered. Elara nodded, her skin prickling with unease. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place, the leaves utterly still. They had only gone a few more steps when the first whisper reached them, a voice so soft it might have been imagined, just on the edge of hearing. Elara froze, her breath catching. There it was again, her name. Kaela's grip on her sword tightened. "You heard that too, right?" Elara didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the trees ahead, where the shadows seemed to shift and coil without any light to cast them. The whisper came again, louder this time, a chorus of voices overlapping, some pleading, some laughing, some screaming. The ground beneath their feet trembled, a faint, rhythmic vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears. She knew that rhythm. It was the same as the altar's pulse, the same as the lock's heartbeat. The forest ahead parted, the trees bending away to reveal a path that hadn't been there before, a narrow, winding trail lined with stones that gleamed wetly in the dim light. At the end of that path stood a door, not a grand, ornate thing, but simple, weathered wood, its surface carved with runes that made Elara's eyes water to look at. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the voices now unmistakable. They were calling her. Kaela's hand found hers, her grip bruising. "We don't have to go in there," she said, her voice low. Elara squeezed back, her throat tight. "Yes," she said softly. "We do." The door swung open before they reached it, revealing not a room, not a building, but an endless expanse of darkness, swirling and alive. The whispers became a roar, the voices of countless keyholders, past and present, all screaming at once. Elara took a deep breath, her fingers interlacing with Kaela's. Together, they stepped forward, into the dark, into the heart of the lock, into the final battle they had been running from since the beginning. The door slammed shut behind them, and the world went silent. Chapter 44. The darkness was absolute, a living thing that pressed against Elara's skin like a physical weight, cold and unyielding. She couldn't see Kaela beside her, couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, but she could feel the other woman's grip, tight enough to grind bone. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it was deafening. Then, slowly, light began to seep into the void, not the warm glow of fire or sunlight, but a sickly, pulsing green, emanating from somewhere ahead. As Elara's eyes adjusted, the shape of a vast chamber emerged, its walls lined with countless doors, each one identical to the one they had just stepped through. At the center of the chamber stood a figure, their back turned, their form shrouded in a cloak of shifting shadows. The green light came from a source at their feet, a pool of liquid that bubbled and churned, its surface reflecting not the chamber, but countless other places, other times. The figure turned, and Elara's breath caught. It was her, not a mirror image, not a trick of the light, but her, same scars, same eyes, same weariness etched into every line of her face. The other Elara smiled, but the expression was wrong, twisted. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice a perfect mimicry of Elara's own. Kaela's grip tightened impossibly further. "What the hell is this?" The other Elara's smile widened. "The heart of the lock," she said, gesturing to the doors around them. "Every keyholder, every sacrifice, every failure, all leading to this moment." She took a step forward, the green light casting her face in ghastly relief. "You thought you were ending the cycle, but you were just feeding it." Elara's mouth was dry, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her throat. "Who are you?" The other Elara laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like shattering glass. "I'm the one who got away," she said. "The one who refused to be a sacrifice. And now," she spread her arms wide, "I'm the lock." The pool at her feet surged, the liquid rising into a towering column, its surface shifting to reveal 1,000 different versions of Elara, each one screaming, each one dying in a different way. The other Elara's eyes gleamed with something like triumph. "Your turn." Chapter 45. The chamber shook as the pool's liquid surged higher, the column of green-black fluid twisting into something monstrous, its surface alive with screaming faces. The other Elara, the lock, stood at its base, her arms outstretched, her expression rapturous. "This is how it ends," she crowed, her voice layered with the echoes of countless keyholders. "This is how it always ends." Kaela's sword was in her hand before Elara could blink, the blade flashing as she lunged, but the lock simply waved a hand, and Kaela froze mid-step, her body locking up as if encased in invisible chains. Elara's heart lurched. "Kaela." The lock turned to her, her smile widening. "She can't help you now," she purred. "This is between us." The monstrous column of liquid loomed closer, its surface bubbling with grasping hands, with pleading faces, with the ghosts of every keyholder who had come before. Elara's hands ached with the memory of the fragments, her scars burning as if freshly made. She had no weapon, no power, nothing but the weight of her own choices. The lock stepped closer, her fingers brushing Elara's cheek in a mockery of tenderness. "You could join me," she whispered. "We could be more than sacrifices. We could be gods." The faces in the liquid surged forward, their voices a cacophony of pleas and threats, their hands clawing at the air. Elara closed her eyes, blocking them out, focusing instead on the one thing the lock couldn't touch, the quiet, unshakable certainty that had carried her through every battle, every loss. She wasn't just a keyholder. She wasn't just a sacrifice. She was Elara, and she was done playing by the lock's rules. When she opened her eyes, the lock's smile faltered. "What?" Elara didn't give her time to finish. She reached into the heart of the liquid, into the seething mass of lost keyholders, and she pulled. The lock screamed as the power within the column surged into Elara, the liquid turning to smoke in her grasp, the faces dissolving into light. The chamber shook harder, the doors along the walls rattling in their frames, the green light flaring bright enough to blind. The lock's form began to unravel, her edges fraying, her expression twisting into something between fury and fear. "You can't," she shrieked. "You'll destroy everything." Elara didn't stop. The power burned through her, searing her from the inside out, but she held on, pulling harder, deeper, until the lock's screams became her own, until the chamber itself began to collapse around them. Kaela's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. "Elara." Elara turned, her vision swimming, her body alight with power. Kaela was free, her sword forgotten, her hands reaching for Elara. "Let go," she begged. "You don't have to do this alone." The lock's laughter echoed through the disintegrating chamber, her form now little more than a wisp of smoke. "She's right, you know," she taunted. "You could let go. You could walk away." Elara's grip on the power faltered, the weight of it crushing, the pain unbearable. She looked at Kaela, at the woman who had stood by her through everything, and she made her choice. With a final, wrenching effort, she let the power go, not back into the lock, not into the void, but into Kaela. The chamber exploded in light, the doors shattering, the walls collapsing, the lock screen cutting off abruptly. The last thing Elara saw before the darkness took her was Kaela's face, alight with power, her eyes blazing green as she reached for her. Then, nothing. Chapter 46. The world returned in fragments. First the scent of damp earth and crushed herbs, then the crackling warmth of a fire nearby, and finally the rough texture of a woolen blanket beneath her fingertips. Elara's eyelids felt like they'd been sewn shut, but she forced them open anyway, blinking against the dim amber glow of firelight dancing across a low, smoke-blackened ceiling. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she tried to sit up, her arms shaking with the effort. A familiar calloused hand pressed against her shoulder, gently but firmly pushing her back down. "Don't." Kaela's voice was rougher than usual, scraped raw like she'd been shouting for days. "You're not ready yet." Elara turned her head, slowly, gods, so slowly, to see Kaela kneeling beside the pallet, her face drawn and shadowed in the flickering light. There was something different about her, something in the way the firelight caught in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of green deep in the pupils. The memories came flooding back, the chamber, the lock, the surge of power as she'd poured everything into Kaela. Her throat tightened. How long? 3 days. Kaela's fingers twitched where they still rested on Elara's shoulder, like she wanted to pull away but couldn't bring herself to break contact entirely. "You nearly burned yourself out." The small hut they were in was unfamiliar, low-ceilinged and cramped, the walls lined with drying herbs and strange symbols carved into the wooden beams. Through the single small window, Elara could see the deep purple of twilight settling over a dense forest. Not the whispering woods, but somewhere else entirely. Where? Safe. For now. Kaela finally withdrew her hand, turning to poke at the fire with a stick. The flames hissed and spat, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. "An old woman found us in the ruins after everything brought us here." Elara studied Kaela's profile, the new tension in her jaw, the way her fingers trembled slightly around the stick. "And the lock." Kaela's breath hitched, just for a second. "Gone. But not destroyed." Elara could hear the unspoken word as clearly as if Kaela had shouted it. The power had to go somewhere, and now it was in Kaela. The fire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, an owl called, the sound too sharp, too knowing. Kaela's shoulders hunched forward, her grip on the stick turning white-knuckled. "It talks to me," she admitted quietly, so low Elara almost didn't catch it. "The power, it whispers." Elara's chest ached. She knew those whispers, had carried them herself for so long. Reaching out, she covered Kaela's hand with her own, ignoring the way her fingers protested the movement. The skin-to-skin contact sent a jolt through them both, not pain, but recognition. The power knew her, remembered her. Kaela turned her hand over, gripping Elara's fingers tightly. "What do we do now?" Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches of the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, or maybe just the cry of some night bird. Elara squeezed back. "We rest," she said, "and then we find Dain." Because if the lock was truly inside Kaela now, then the game had changed. And Dain would be coming for them. The fire burned lower, the shadows stretching longer. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm wasn't over, it had only just begun. Chapter 47. The old woman returned at dawn, her cloak dripping with morning dew, her arms laden with fresh herbs and something that might have been a rabbit, if rabbits had 6 legs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. She took one look at Elara sitting upright and let out a sound that was half grunt, half chuckle. "Told you she'd live," she said to Kaela, dumping her haul onto the rough-hewn table in the center of the hut. "Stubborn, these keyholders, always have been." Up close, the woman was older than Elara had first thought, not just elderly, but ancient, her skin like crumpled parchment stretched too thin over sharp bones, her eyes milky with cataracts that somehow didn't seem to hinder her sight. She moved with an odd, shuffling grace, her gnarled fingers making quick work of the strange rabbit's pelt as she hummed tunelessly under her breath. Kaela, who had barely slept from what Elara could tell, watched the woman with wary eyes, her hand never far from the hilt of the sword leaning against her chair. She says she knew Dain, she muttered to Elara, back when he was still human. The old woman cackled, the sound like dry leaves crunching underfoot. Oh, he was never human, dearie. Not really, just better at pretending than most. She plucked one of the glowing eyes from the rabbit and popped it into her mouth, crunching thoughtfully. Tastes like regret, she announced, holding out the other eye toward Elara. Want one? Elara declined as politely as she could manage, which only made the woman laugh harder. Suit yourself. She tossed the remaining eye into a bubbling pot over the fire, stirring the contents with a bone that looked suspiciously like a human finger. Dain'll be coming for you soon, you know. Can't have two keyholders running around. Throws off the balance. Kaela stiffened. I'm not a keyholder. The woman's milky eyes fixed on Kaela with unsettling precision. Aren't you? The air in the hut grew heavy, the fire dimming as if in response to the sudden tension. Elara could see the way Kaela's fingers twitched, the faintest glimmer of green flickering beneath her nails before she clenched her fists to hide it. The old woman sighed, suddenly looking every one of her countless years. Eat the stew, she said, ladling the dubious concoction into wooden bowls. Then I'll tell you how to find the weaver. Only one who might help you now. Elara accepted the bowl, the broth swirling with colors that didn't exist in nature. The weaver, the woman's smile revealed teeth filed to points. Oh yes, the one who spun the first lock. The one Dain fears above all others. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of herbs and something darker. If you want to survive what's coming, you'll need her. Outside, the six-legged rabbit's remaining eye, forgotten on the table, blinked once, and then dissolved into smoke. Chapter 51. The silence after the door closed was absolute, a void so complete it pressed against Elara's eardrums like physical weight. She couldn't see Kaela beside her, couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, but she could feel the other woman's fingers interlaced with hers, the grip so tight it bordered on painful. Time had no meaning here. Minutes or centuries might have passed before the first whisper reached them, a voice so soft it might have been imagination. Keyholders. The word echoed through the nothingness, reverberating in Elara's bones. The darkness around them shifted, not parting exactly, but thinning enough to reveal a path lined with faint, pulsing lights that resolved into faces, every keyholder who had ever stood where they now stood, their expressions ranging from resignation to hope. At the end of the path stood the weaver, her cloak now tattered at the edges, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. You weren't supposed to come through, she said, her voice fraying at the edges. Kaela's grip tightened. Then why show us the door? The weaver's smile was sad. Because someone had to be willing to walk through it. The path beneath their feet began to solidify, the darkness receding to reveal a bridge spanning an endless abyss, its surface carved with runes that told the story of the lock, the power, the endless cycle of containment and failure. The other keyholders fell into step behind them, a silent procession of ghosts and memories. The bridge led to a platform floating in the void, at its center a pedestal holding a single object, a needle, long and silver and humming with latent energy. The weaver gestured to it. The first stitch, the beginning of the pattern. Elara reached out, her fingers hovering just above the needle. What do we do? The weaver's form was growing fainter, her edges dissolving into the darkness. What you were always meant to do. Reweave the world. The first touch of metal to skin sent a jolt through Elara so violent it nearly knocked her off her feet. Visions flooded her mind, not just of the past, but of possibilities, of futures that could be if the pattern was changed. Kaela's hand closed over hers, adding her strength, her will, and together they plunged the needle into the fabric of the void itself. Chapter 52. The world tore apart around them with a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering simultaneously, the void fracturing into countless shards that reflected not darkness but light, scenes from 100 different lives, 100 different worlds where the lock had held or failed or never existed at all. Elara's skin burned with the effort of holding the needle steady as it dragged the joined hands in slow, deliberate arcs, leaving behind threads of gold and green that wove themselves into the very fabric of reality. Kaela's breath came in ragged gasps beside her, the power they'd taken from Dain now flowing through them both, stitching closed wounds in existence they hadn't even realized were there. The keyholders behind them began to fade one by one, their forms dissolving into the growing tapestry with expressions of peace, their purpose finally fulfilled. The weaver was the last to go, her tattered cloak merging with the threads as she whispered her final words. "Don't look back." Then it was just the two of them, standing at the center of a universe remaking itself, the needle growing heavier with each passing moment as the last of the power drained from their bodies into the new pattern. The void was gone now, replaced by swirling colors that resolved slowly into familiar shapes, trees, sky, the distant outline of mountains. The whispering woods, but not as they'd left them. This version was vibrant, alive in a way Elara had never seen, the trees standing tall and unbroken, the air clean of the taint that had lingered for so long. The needle fell from their numb fingers, landing soundlessly on grass that hadn't existed moments before. Kaela swayed on her feet, her face pale but her eyes clear of the green glow at last. "Is it over?" Elara opened her mouth to answer, but the words died in her throat as a familiar voice spoke from behind them. "Not quite." Chapter 53. Dain stood at the edge of the clearing, his golden eyes dulled to a pale amber, his once imposing frame now gaunt and hunched. The shadows that had clung to him like a second skin were gone, leaving only a man who looked every one of his countless years. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a gesture that might have been surrender or supplication. "I remember," he said, his voice cracking. "All of it. For the first time in centuries, I remember." Kaela moved before Elara could stop her, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides to grab Dain by the front of his tattered robes. "You don't get to come back from this," she snarled, her fist drawn back to strike. Dain didn't resist, didn't even flinch. "I know." Something in his tone gave Elara pause. The hatred still burned in her chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, pity. Understanding. She placed a hand on Kaela's arm. "Wait." Dain's gaze met hers over Kaela's shoulder. "The power is gone. Truly gone. What you did, it unmade everything it touched. Including me." He gestured to himself with a shaking hand. "This is all that's left." Kaela's fist trembled, but she didn't strike. "You expect us to believe that? After everything?" Dain's smile was a ghost of its former self. "No, but I'm asking you to let me prove it." The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the very air thick with the weight of the decision. Elara studied Dain's face, the lines of pain, the hollows under his eyes, the utter lack of the arrogance that had once defined him. This wasn't the monster they'd fought for so long. This was just a man. A broken, tired man. She nodded to Kaela. "Let him go." Kaela's grip tightened for one last second before she released him with a shove. "One wrong move," she warned. Dain rubbed at his throat, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't expect anything less." He turned slowly, gesturing to a path that hadn't been there a moment ago, a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, lined with stones that gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight. "There's something you need to see." Chapter 54. The path wound through the heart of the whispering woods, the trees parting before them like reluctant sentinels. Dain walked ahead, his steps slow but steady, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of memory. Elara kept one hand on Kaela's arm as they followed, her senses straining for any hint of deception, but the forest around them felt clean. Alive in a way it never had before, the usual whispers replaced by birdsong, the oppressive gloom banished by shafts of golden sunlight. The trail ended abruptly at the base of an enormous oak, its trunk wider than a house, its branches stretching so high they disappeared into the clouds. Carved into the bark was a door, not the ominous, rune-covered portals they'd grown accustomed to, but something simpler, homier. Dain placed a hand against it with something like reverence. "This is where it began," he said softly. "The first lock, the first mistake." The door swung open at his touch, revealing not a room but a memory. The younger Dain, kneeling in a sun-drenched glade, his hands outstretched toward a swirling mass of darkness that hovered just above the ground. A woman stood beside him, the weaver, but younger, her face inlined, her cloak still whole. "You don't have to do this," she was saying, her voice thick with tears. The memory Dain shook his head. "It's the only way to save them." He reached into the darkness, his hands closing around something unseen, and screamed as the power flooded into him, his eyes turning gold, his skin darkening with creeping veins. The scene shifted, the same glade, but years later. The weaver, older now, her cloak beginning to fray, standing over a pedestal where the silver needle lay. The memory Dain stood across from her, but he was changed, taller, broader, his eyes glowing with unnatural light. "It's not enough," he snarled. "The power is too strong. We need a better solution." The weaver's hands trembled as she lifted the needle. "Then we weave a new pattern." The memory dissolved, replaced by another, and another, centuries of attempts to contain what should never have been taken, each failure leading to greater desperation, greater corruption. Elara's stomach churned as the final memory took shape. Dain standing over the weaver's broken body, the needle clutched in his fist, his face twisted in triumph. "I'll find another way," he promised her fading form. "A way to keep it forever." The door slammed shut, the vision ending as abruptly as it began. The present-day Dain sagged against the tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I was wrong," he whispered. "About everything." Chapter 55. The sun was setting by the time Dain finished his story, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple that reflected in the still waters of the pond they'd settled beside. He looked smaller somehow in the fading light, diminished, the last remnants of his power gone with the memories he'd shared. Kaela sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but Elara could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tapped restlessly against her thigh. "So what now?" Kaela asked at last. "You expect forgiveness, redemption?" Dain shook his head, his gaze fixed on the water. "No, I expect nothing." He reached into his tattered robes and withdrew a small, worn book, its cover plain, its pages yellowed with age. "But I can give you this." Elara took it carefully, the leather warm beneath her fingers. "What is it?" "The weaver's journal. The one she kept before everything." Dain's hand lingered on the cover for a moment before he pulled away. "It explains how to maintain the new pattern. How to keep the door closed." Kaela's eyes narrowed. "And why should we trust anything you give us?" Dain stood slowly, his joints creaking like an old man's. "You shouldn't, but it's all I have left to give." He turned toward the pond, his reflection wavering in the twilight. "The power is gone, but the knowledge shouldn't die with me." Elara opened the journal, the first page revealing an elegant script that seemed to shift slightly under her gaze. "To whoever finds this, asterisk," it began, "remember, a lock is only as strong as the hands that hold the key." Asterisk. The words resonated deep in her chest, settling like a puzzle piece she hadn't realized was missing. Dain took a step into the water, the surface rippling around his ankles. "I won't ask you to come after me," he said without turning. "But I will ask you to remember, not the monster I became, but the man I was. The man who tried, however foolishly, to save the world." Kaela surged to her feet. "Dain," but it was too late. He stepped forward, the water closing over his head with barely a splash, the pond stilling moments later as if he'd never been there at all. The journal in Elara's hands grew heavier, its weight a promise and a warning. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, the sound echoing through the trees. The first stars began to appear overhead, their light clear and bright in a way Elara had never seen before. The door was closed. The pattern was woven. And somewhere between the stitches, two shadows walked on, their fingers intertwined, their footsteps soundless on the soft earth. Waiting. Watching. at rest, but not gone. Never gone.